Hi everybody. Welcome to an extraordinary episode of the Wife of Caesar, a rather short episode, or at least shorter. We are coming to you on a Wednesday of all days because we want to discuss with you a piece of breaking news involving former president of Peru, Mr. Alan Garcia. Now, Mr. Garcia has passed away earlier today, and he passed away while still under investigation for several acts of corruption. Now, let me give you a little bit of context. Mr. Garcia was president of Peru from 1985 to 1990, and then again from 2006 to 2011. To give you an idea, this is the notion of Mr. Garcia being involved in bribery and corruption schemes is anything but new. He had been investigated since August in 2015 for several acts, but most notably of which he was accused of the crimes of generic active bribery, so offering to pay bribes, improper passive bribery, which is the receiving side of bribery, receiving bribes in order to do or refrain from doing something that may or may not be within your post, and collusion, which is the abuse of a public office to be involved improperly to benefit a participant in a tender or a bid. The accusation that was leveled against Mr. Garcia back in 2015, was that he had been paid bribes by the Brazilian group OAS. Now, the Brazilian group, this may sound familiar because OAS has been thoroughly investigated in the context of the Lava Jato scheme and obviously the Odebrecht corruption scandal, which dates all the way to back then, and of course is the tree that keeps on giving. The Brazilian group was involved in the tender for what was called Section 4 of the Interoceanic Highway. It's just an infrastructure project, and Mr. Garcia was accused of receiving bribes in order to favor OAS. Now, the result of that accusation back then was that a mega commission in charge of investigating the scheme or the accusations was formed in the Peruvian Congress. However, that commission yielded no results, or at least no tangible results, because Mr. Garcia was not prosecuted back then. Also in August of 2015, Mr. Garcia was accused of the crime of proper passive bribery. These are all legal terms, by the way, contained or explained in the Peruvian criminal code, but they all pertain to the act of corruption known as bribery. So he was charged also, he was accused of proper passive bribery, which is receiving bribes in order to do something or in exchange for doing something that is outside the scope of the public office. The Peruvian criminal code is very specific as to how it prosecutes the crime of bribery, but essentially the accusation that was leveled back then was that Mr. Garcia was receiving improper payments, bribes, in exchange for accelerating the pardoning process for convicted drug dealers. Now, this may sound familiar. You may remember in the back of your minds, it was known as the narcoindultos scandal, and essentially the president was accused of selling presidential pardons to higher level drug dealers. Very quaint of him. Now, again, this was investigated, but no prosecutions were yielded as a result. And again, in 2018, and the case that brings us to today, was that Mr. Garcia was being charged with proper passive bribery, which is, again, just receiving bribes in exchange for doing something that is outside the scope of the public office. And the accusation against Mr. Garcia was that he was receiving bribes. He was also accused of collusion, money laundering, and influence peddling, involved in the construction of Line 1 of the Lima subway. Again, an infrastructure product. What happened here is that in November of 2018, Peru has its own anti-corruption tribunal, its own anti-corruption court. And in November 2018, that court issued a warrant that prohibited Mr. Garcia from leaving the country. His response was, well, it's no punishment. It isn't really a punishment to be kept in my country for 18 months. But he immediately requested a political asylum from the embassy of Uruguay. It later came to be known that he also requested asylum from the embassies of Costa Rica and Colombia, which denied denied his request. After 1 month of assessing the situation, the embassy of Uruguay issued a statement denying the request for political asylum. And within the context of that statement, it also said, "We invite Mr. Garcia to kindly leave our diplomatic residence." So essentially a very, very polite way of saying no and please go away. Once Mr. Garcia was denied his request, he decided to stay in Peru. And today was the day on which that particular court issued a warrant for his arrest. Now, this was a preventative measure in that it's very important to note the difference. It's very important to note the difference. It wasn't a definitive warrant for his arrest. That means that he had not been placed in jail. He wasn't being placed in jail indefinitely because he had yet to stand trial. But the tribunal determined that he was a flight risk. Essentially, there was a danger of him leaving the country. So they decided to place him in police custody. When the officers came this morning to serve the warrant on Mr. Garcia, he examined it, he excused himself, claiming that he needed to make a phone call, and he took his own life. Now, this, of course, is very tragic. The conclusion of this investigation and this scheme of accusations should not have ended this way, and the death of Mr. Garcia is definitely tragic. However, it is relevant to note that an investigation as thorough and as complex as the Lavallato-Odebrecht investigation/scandal has yielded so many results throughout different countries in Latin America that several presidents and former presidents have been indicted and even charged. 2 other former presidents of Peru itself have been indicted, one of whom is currently at large, and he is awaiting extradition into the US. Who, by the way, taught at Harvard for a brief period of time. So this is relevant, and it's very important to talk about this bit of news because although it had a very, very tragic conclusion, these investigations are yielding results. Of course, not very clearly in countries like Venezuela and Mexico, but at least in other different countries of Latin America, they are yielding results. So there is indeed a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel for countries like Latin America, at least concerning corruption. So, this was it for today for a very, very short improvised episode of The Wife of Caesar. Pardon the lack of a set. And so we will see you again on Monday, and have an excellent week.